Okay, so Alexei, I want to talk about something that we sort of touched on this morning. And you might hate this, but I really want you to think about it. If you are killed, if this does happen, what message do you leave behind to the Russian people?
Alexei Navalny has taken on the most dangerous job in the world, challenging the leader of the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin.
If I want to be a leader of this country, if I want to fight Putin, I have to organize people.
Война в Украине и война в Сирии. Я прекращу войну.
The Kremlin hates Navalny so much, they refuse to say his name.
I was banned from everything and blacklisted. But as I became more and more famous, I was totally sure that it will be problematic for them to kill me.
And boy, were you wrong.
Yes, I was very wrong.
Alexei Navalny arrives at this hospital in Berlin.
To have your dad, an opposition leader, being poisoned, it was literally like a book.
Come on, poisoned? Seriously?
We were so shocked. It's like Putin's leaving a signature on a crime scene.
It's kind of stupid.
We found a domestic assassination machine on an industrial scale.
Navalny will personally call his poisoners one by one.
Это Навальный, Алексей, вас беспокоит. Хотел узнать, зачем вы хотели меня убить.
Oh my God, you ruined their day.
Navalny is stepping into a showdown with the Kremlin.
I want to go back and try to change Russia.
It's something worth fighting for.
Are you not scared, Alexei?
Поэтому бездействовать не надо.
Hello, I'm Olivia Mattis, and I'm delighted that you've decided to spend part of your Sunday with us today. I represent the Sousa Mendes Foundation, and for most Sundays for the past 3 years, we've been showing programs to do with moral courage, rescue, resistance, and hope. Normally, we focus on a figure of World War II, but not always. And today, we have one of our most heroic contemporary figures, who is the subject of this beautiful film that won the Academy Award, and that is Alexei Navalny. So we have a fantastic panel for you. We have Mr. Carl von Habsburg, whose family, like my own, was saved in 1940 by our hero that we honor here at the Sousa Mendes Foundation, Aristides de Sousa Mendes. And Carl von Habsburg had a pivotal role to play in the making of the film that you all saw, Navalny. Then we announced that we were having a mystery guest. Well, he's a mystery no longer, and that is Christo Grozev, who is the heart and soul, together with Navalny, of this film. He is the investigative journalist from Bellingcat who cracked the case as to who poisoned Navalny. And I am just beyond thrilled and honored that he is with us today. So you have the opportunity to ask your questions to our illustrious panel. Finally, let me introduce my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Judd Newborn, who specializes in stories of rescue and resistance, and he will be the moderator for today's program. So Judd, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivia, and greetings to everyone. As Olivia said, I'm Judd Newborn. I served as founding historian of New York's Holocaust Museum, the Museum of Jewish Heritage. Today, among other things, I'm one author and dramatic multimedia storyteller, often on themes relating unique stories of the Holocaust and World War II and resistance to today's most compelling issues, especially human rights and the fight for democracy. Just apropos of our program today, during my doctoral fieldwork in Germany for the University of Chicago, I worked very briefly and modestly undercover for Poland's Solidarity Freedom Movement 6 months into the Communist declaration of martial law and the sealing of Poland's borders. Now, I'm going to tell you a bit more about the program. We have a very different kind of program, as you heard, one of utmost current events importance, but with meaningful connections to the spirit of Aristides de Sousa Mendes. We're focusing on one of today's greatest activists for democracy, Russia's Alexei Navalny. The documentary is extraordinary, showing how the Bulgarian investigative journalist, Christo Grozev, discovered and confronted, along with Navalny and his team, all 8 co-conspirators who plotted Navalny's poisoning. We also see Navalny's 2021 voluntary return to Russia and his immediate arrest, with thousands of Russians protesting. And just to remind you how timely this program is, just this past Friday, the New York Times reported that Alexei Navalny was sentenced to yet another 19 years in a penal colony. Now, we're delighted to have assembled the major figures in this story and film, which has captured world attention, and I'm going to tell you just a little more than Olivia did about our guests. Our first guest, Herr Carl von Habsburg, was crucial in midwifing the creation of the Navalny documentary. Herr von Habsburg puts little store in titles, but his 1,000-year lineage is of such deep historical import that I think I should mention it. So he is the son of the late Otto von Habsburg, whose family was rescued by Sousa Mendes in 1940, as you heard, the subject of a previous foundation program. And he is the grandson of the last Austro-Hungarian emperor himself, Charles I. Following in his father's Otto's footsteps, Carl von Habsburg has devoted himself to creating a strong, unified, and democratic Europe, including as member of the European Parliament and president of the Austrian branch of the Pan-American Union. He has also successfully advocated NATO and international accords to protect cultural heritage sites from armed conflicts. He has personally led humanitarian relief efforts and operates a radio station based in Ukraine to fight propaganda. Our second guest is Christo Grozev. He is a renowned Bulgarian investigative journalist and author who cracked the Navalny poisoning case. He is the lead Russia investigator with Bellingcat, an independent collective of researchers, investigators, and citizen journalists brought together by a passion for open source research, which includes focusing on security threats, extra-territorial clandestine operations, and the weaponizing of information. His investigations into the identity of the suspects involved in the prior notorious 2018 poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in England earned him and his team the European Press Prize for Investigative Journalism. Okay, so now, if we may, let's start with Carl von Habsburg. Carl, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Judd, for inviting me, because of course, I mean, when I heard that I can do something with the Sousa Mendes Foundation, that was something that was intriguing me immediately, because of course the name Sousa Mendes is for us Habsburg a household name, something we have been talking about with our father or our uncles a lot when we were talking about what was happening in the Second World War. And so we were, I think, rather acquainted with his activities and with the huge amount of people that he has saved. And it was absolutely fascinating for me to have the first conversations with you, Olivia, and learning more about the foundation and learning more how much the heritage is kept up through the foundation. So first of all, thank you very much, A, for the work you are doing, and B, for inviting me to this illustrious panel and also to talk in the framework of your programs. Judd, you mentioned before what happened to Navalny, that he was basically just a few days ago, many more years were added to his sentence. So in some way, of course, I see quite some parallels that are kind of offering themselves up there. None the last one, which is that both Sousa Mendes and Alexei Navalny were both honored by the European Parliament and by the European Union at a specific state. I mean, Susa Mendes was having there was a commemorative celebration at the European Parliament. I was at that time a member of the European Parliament. So together with my father, we were both engaged in making sure that his memory would be kept up in that institution. And of course, Navalny was getting the Sakharov Prize in 21 from the European Parliament. So both were basically honored by the same institution. And I think both were also, or are playing, a incredibly important role for their country in the different activities which were recognized through the European Parliament. Of course, the time of the Second World War was a different time than what we see today, but I think the parallels that we are seeing are the fact that as well the Second World War as the war that we are actually observing today in Ukraine are both wars that are about ideologies. We see the clash of ideologies. We see that it is a war about values. It is about values that we consider important and that we have decided to defend. It's values like rule of law, it's values like human rights, it's values like democracy. And of course, in his time, yes, of course, in the Second World War, the situation was different, but Susa Mendes was the person who was fighting, he was praying for his own conscience to be able to do something against the orders of his government in order to save lives. And he came to the conclusion that that's what he wants to do because he was absolutely steadfast in his values. He was very strong in his values and he decided to defend them. And in another way, Navalny was doing the same, that he was absolutely clear to his principles. And I remember we had several conversations with him after he started to recover from the poisoning and before he went back to Russia, whether he really wanted to go back to Russia. And he said, if I want to stay credible, yes, of course, I have to go back to Russia. And yes, I know I will end up in jail. So it's this principles, it's this belief in values, the belief in principles that really joins these two people. And of course, we have to ask ourselves, I could talk hours now logically about the war in Ukraine. You mentioned before, Judd, that I'm working there with media, but I mean, I just want to kind of go into one point. I mean, I'm of course very clear about the fact that, like I suppose most other people that are listening in right now, that we do want Ukraine to win, but it becomes a little bit more complicated when we are talking about what winning actually means. So, I mean, I think that the winning bit consists out of three different points, and I'll just be very brief at that. So the one point is the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. That is completely clear. The second point is the reparations that will have to be paid. But the third point, and that's the point where I'm coming really back to Navalny, is of course one of the goals that we have to get for ourselves is that we want to see regime change in Russia. Because I mean, when I'm asking myself as a soldier, what is the most important thing in the coming days? It's the question, do I get enough ammunition or do I get enough food the next week? And when I am a strategist, I'm probably asking where do I have my armies in 6 months from now? But I'm somebody who is trying to think politically geostrategic in some way. So I'm asking myself, I have 3 relatively young children. In which world do I want them to live in 20 or 30 years from now? And of course, I do want them to live in a world which has Russia as a good and positive and strong neighbor, but also a neighbor that believes in those values that are important for us, like democracy, like rule of law, like human rights. And of course, for that, it needs some rather drastic changes in Russia. And this is, I think, very much the point where we are getting to what can be done in Russia or who can be doing something. We are seeing in Russia a situation that can to some way be compared to Germany after the Second World War. We can see that it was necessary to do a lot, not only of denazification. So in Russia, it would be necessary to do some de-Stalinization, but it would also be necessary to do some re-education of values, as we have seen through the war, how much those values were actually violated. Because of course, we want a strong and good Russia as a future partner. But for that, it needs some change in the value system which is actually happening there. But this change cannot happen. It cannot come from us. It cannot come from the outside. We have neither the resources nor the power to actually do this. This is a change which has to come from the inside. I truly and strongly believe that the current criminal regime in Moscow will not last all that long. I really hope that sooner than later it will be over, but we need another option for that. And this is one of the points where Navalny is coming in, who is considered as probably currently the most important opposition leader in the framework of Russia. He has a huge structure within Russia. He is probably right now the only person in the opposition that can organize demonstrations in all of Russia at the same time. There are others too. It's of course not only Navalny. We have to be clear about that. But he's definitely the one who can rally the most people for making specific points, for being politically active, for talking about his values. And yes, of course, his main point has been the anti-corruption point. And with his anti-corruption organization, he has pointed out corruption as one of the biggest problems that are in existence in Russia and that has to be changed. And the films that he has done about Putin's palace and certain other films that he has been doing were absolutely amazing to show this up. And this way, he has turned himself really in one of the current leader of the opposition, who is, with his value system, capable of potentially helping Russia to get into a brighter future if he gets the possibility to do that. But of course, that does not work with the current criminal regime that we are having in Moscow and where it is really necessary to get to the change. But before I finish, let me just say a couple of sentences to how it came. I mean, I really don't see my role as that important to do the movie. This was really Daniel Roja, this was Christo Grozev, and a lot of other friends that were doing this absolute masterpiece. I was only had the possibility to be there in the beginning and bring a couple of friends together. I can tell you in 3-4 sentences how it started. I was working through a mutual friend together with Daniel on a documentary that had something to do remotely with UNESCO and other organizations where we were talking about cultural heritage protection. And we were hitting it off immediately, very good. We had an incredibly good way of talking and common interests. And we hit it off as friends immediately very well. And while we were working on that project, also in the collaboration with Christo, we came to another documentary that we wanted to do together, which was connected to Russia. I'm not going too deep into that one because this is a documentary which is currently lying on ice and has to be kind of revived at a later stage. But while we were working on that second documentary, the whole story about Navalny came up. And I'm not getting into this because, of course, this is Christo's story. He figured all of that out, what happened to Navalny. And we were going like, this is a time-sensitive, a time-important story. Let's move our team, which is a great team, from the other project to the Navalny project. And so that was, I think, a really good move. Usually, you say the better is the enemy of the good. In this case, we switched to the better, and it turned out to be even better than what we had expected because the team was really good. And so we were just very lucky, and we are very grateful that we had on one side Christo, who was bringing all this information into the game with his incessant research and with his incredible ability to find all these details that would kind of add to that and many other stories. Judd, you mentioned some of them in the beginning, but also, of course, to have somebody like Daniel as the director who would have the feeling to take this material, package this material in a way with a deep understanding for the situation and for the people that were involved in it. And that's one of his great fortes, as I can see and I can vouch for, and really turn it into an absolute masterpiece. And this is basically the only role I could play. Thank you. You called it in the beginning a little bit of a midwife role. Yes, that's a little bit how I feel, that I could put the right people together in the beginning. And I'm very glad and very grateful to that. And well, thank you very much for having me.
So let's turn now to Christo. Christo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll probably start a little bit with the chronology of the inception of the project that Carl referred to, and then I'll move to my observations of Navalny, the political phenomenon that for me was a process. It didn't start and end in the same place. My perception and my analysis of who Navalny is, and I think it might be useful to share my progression of my understanding of Navalny. But in terms of chronology, Carl is right. Carl introduced me to Daniel Rohr, this amazing young director. We started working on a film that was almost a prologue to the current war in Ukraine. But there was a hiatus in the film. We couldn't proceed with the filming because of some logistical problems. And I remember that Daniel Rohr was sitting in my office in Vienna, in Austria, where I used to live. And he was feeling a bit depressed because he couldn't continue functioning. He couldn't continue functioning as a director. The film was not going further fast enough. His girlfriend from Canada was calling him and asking, why are you there doing nothing? Why don't you come back home? So it was just a miracle, a fortunate miracle that at that very moment, I think that I got a sort of a first understanding that I may be cracking this other investigation, the Navalny poisoning. And I just exclaimed in the presence of Daniel, you know, I think I may have a lead on who poisoned Navalny. And he just took the camera and started filming. And he didn't take the camera down for the next 6 months. He just captured every moment from the first phrase that I said, I think I may have an idea, until Navalny left for Germany, for Moscow several months later. So it was continuous filming. He was a fly on the wall, but he was also a participant in the conversations with Navalny. He challenged Navalny. He wanted to make sure that he's not going to make a film about somebody who's a bad person or a bad politician. He wanted to be convinced that the film is going to help the good side and not some dark side. And this leads me to my own movement and progression and dynamic of understanding Navalny. I started looking into that phenomenon back in 2013-14 when I was still a blogger, and I was trying to analyze what's happening in Russia, not being allowed to go to Russia because I was blacklisted by their security service at around the same time because of my investigations. Navalny was a popular political figure, but he was allowed to be public. He was allowed to say things that others would not dare say. And there were only two hypotheses here that I had. Either he's very brave or he's a fake opposition figure, because in Russia, there's a history of the security services created fake opposition figures in order to control it. So for me, it was a question mark at the very beginning, whether that was an authentic political figure. And to me, the answer came when we were able to acquaint ourselves with some leaked Kremlin correspondence, in which it turned out that the Kremlin itself, the Kremlin political technologists, had created this whole false narrative that Navalny is one of theirs. They were spreading actively the rumors that Navalny is supported by the Kremlin in order to diminish his importance and his relevance. And then something else came to my attention, which was the unwillingness of President Putin to mention his name in public. You could see that the whole PR machine was attacking him, but President Putin would never mention his name in public. He would variously call him a blogger that is unmentionable, or a anti-corruption activist, but never mention the name. And the answer to this mystery came from another leaked correspondence, again, of the political technologist of the Kremlin that I read, in which it seems that the Kremlin had conducted a social polling in about 2016 and 17 about the popularity of different political figures in the country. And they had found out that predictably Putin, with all of the PR and propaganda machine working in his favor, was very popular. And there are two types of questions in social polling: the prompted and unprompted questions. So the prompted question is when somebody is asked, what do you think about President Putin? Do you trust him? And the unprompted version of the same is when people are asked, tell us all of the politicians that you trust. So there was a major difference in Navalny's ranking there, because when a prompted question was being asked, what do you think of Navalny? He got almost the same approval rating as Putin. He was about 67% approval throughout the country. But when an unprompted question was asked, Navalny was rarely mentioned. And I strongly believe that this is what gave the idea of the Kremlin never mention this person. Because when he's mentioned, when people remember him, having not been given any press time on television, people couldn't naturally think of him. But when he's mentioned, people remember how much they trust his investigations. So this was something that for me was important to know, that he was definitely not a fake opposition figure. He was just a brave person. But a second thing that still bothered me was his readiness, Navalny's readiness to talk to, let's say, unsavory characters from the opposition, to mingle with them and to debate with them, or to even join forces against the regime with them. And I confronted him. When I met him several weeks after we started the investigation. And I found out that he genuinely, convincingly believes that the only way that you can change the world is by talking to everybody and trying to openly tell them where the points of difference are between your and their point of view, and maybe find the commonality. And in his own version of the world, he was able to find the commonality of fighting a dictatorship, even in a coalition with people that otherwise he would disagree with. And it was almost that he wanted to create temporary coalitions until the dictatorship is defeated, before he would start working against these same former coalition partners on a purely competitive ideological basis, electoral basis. And the last thing I want to tell you about my impressions from Navalny refers to the family, because Carl mentioned a bit earlier that we had numerous discussions with Alexei about whether it makes sense for him to go back to Russia. We were wondering whether he knew the fate that awaited him. And yes, he knew the fate. He knew that he was going to be arrested. For me, it was important how his family would see the world after he goes back to Russia. And I knew that his family has always been very supportive of his political activity that involves a lot of risk-taking, not only for him, but for the whole family. His brother, Oleg Navalny, served 3.5 years in jail for a completely politically motivated case where the real target was Alexei Navalny, but they could only get his brother. And they jailed him, and his brother sat out the 3 years in jail without complaining. He knew that he's doing this in order to perpetuate and make possible his brother's continued work as a politician. When I confronted his wife, Alexei's wife, silently in outside of the kitchen when Alexei was preparing food for the team, I asked her, "Are you aware that if Alexei goes back to Russia, he will be arrested?" She said, "Of course, Christo, I'm aware." I said, "Are you aware that it's not going to be for a couple of weeks or maybe a couple of months?" And she said, "You're very naive. It will be for years." And I asked, "And you're fine with that?" And she said, "Well, I'm not fine with that, but there's no other way. If Alexei stays here, he will become just a talking head who will talk to the Russian people from a TV screen, but he will live in the comfort of Berlin, a Berlin suburb or a London suburb. He will never be able to raise people, to take them to the streets, because he needs to partake in the risk of the same people that he's vying for the electoral support from. So he needs to be with them. And if they are in jail, he has to be in jail with them." This made me, my skin got goose pimples from this, because I've never seen such a unwavering support from a family member. I asked the same question of his daughter. She said exactly the same thing. And I thought, well, it takes special people in this world to make a change. Most people would not do that. Most family members would not say those words, would not support such a depriving of quality of life, depriving of family time decision. But they did. And I thought how lucky the world is that there are these infrequent families that actually are willing to go into, you can call it martyrdom, but they're willing to actually take the price on themselves in order to effect societal change. And in this context, I'm really happy that today we are having a conversation with a foundation that is named after somebody who did exactly that. So I will stop at that, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
So right now, I'm just going to briefly take back the floor to tell you a little bit about our upcoming programs. And while I'm doing that, if you could continue putting your questions for Mr. Carl von Habsburg and Mr. Christo Grozev into the chat box, then Dr. Judd Newborn will collect your questions and he will ask them of our guests. So let me tell you what's coming up. We have 3 fascinating programs coming up. Our next program is 2 weeks from now. And so we're going to show you some images of these programs so you see what we're talking about. So on August 20th, we are going to feature the story of a couple, and they are called Eberhard and Donata Helmrich. These were anti-Nazi German resistance fighters and rescuers. They were named Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem. They performed their act of rescue in Germany and in Poland. Eberhard Helmrich was sent to Poland. He was managing a farm there. And it was through his work with the farm that he managed to save a lot of Jewish lives of people who were imprisoned in a nearby ghetto. So that's quite an amazing story. Meanwhile, his wife Donata took the women from the ghetto and found jobs for them in Germany, masquerading as Poles or as Ukrainians, where these women would work as domestics in the homes of German families. And these German families didn't know that their employee was a Jewish person whose life was being saved by this remarkable couple. So that is the program we have coming up next for you on August 20th. There's a film that goes with that called 2 Trees in Jerusalem. And the film is called that because both Eberhard and Donata have a tree. Each one has a tree on the Avenue of the Righteous at Yad Vashem. One of the speakers that you'll meet was herself saved by this remarkable couple. The following week, August 27th, we are showing you a program on a very different topic. This is actually a book launch of the man you see on the left. His name is Sam Friedman. It's a book about Hubert Humphrey and the beginning of his political career right after World War II, where he becomes a champion for human rights, meaning civil rights, and also fighting against anti-Semitism. And in dialogue with him will be the woman you see on your right, and that is Jane Eisner, who is the former editor-in-chief of the newspaper The Forward. So that should be quite a fascinating program. It too is free of charge. And then in September, we are going to do a program on this man, Otto Weidt, who was another German rescuer. He is remembered as the blind Oskar Schindler. He was a businessman and a factory owner. He himself was blind, and he ran this workshop for the blind that you see on the right. You see the sign at the bottom there, Workshop for the Blind by Otto Weidt of Otto Weidt. And you see him there in the photo. Next to him was his sighted assistant. Her name was Alice Licht. And together, Otto Weidt and Alice Licht attempted to rescue and hide all of the workers who worked in this factory, who were not only Jewish, but also disabled, visually disabled. So here you have a disabled person rescuing disabled Jews. So that is quite a remarkable story. And when Alice herself was deported to Auschwitz, this man, Otto Weidt, went alone to Auschwitz to try to have her liberated. So this is a unique story, and we will be meeting the grandson of this woman, Alice Licht, on September 10th. So that's what we have upcoming. And now I'm going to turn the floor back to Judd, who will ask your questions of our panelists.
Boy, I must say, Carl and Christo, you've actually answered many of my questions in your very excellent presentations. So let me just make a quick connection to Nazi Germany. I was trying to think who is similar in history to a Navalny voluntarily returning to the country where he will obviously be arrested. And it's very hard to come up with anybody. But I thought of one person, and that's Dietrich Bonhoeffer. In Germany, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was out of Germany from 1938 to 1939. And then he returned in 1939, was finally arrested in 43 and executed in April 45. And so Bonhoeffer's explanation for his motivations actually ring totally with what you have said about Navalny's motivations. And I think that also gives him more credibility in terms of your coming to trust him. Just in brief, Bonhoeffer said, "I have to come to the conclusion that I made a mistake in coming to America. I must live through the difficult period in our national history with the people of Germany. I have no right to participate in the reconstruction of life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people." And he also, regarding the war of ideologies, he said, "Christians in Germany will have to face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying civilization. I cannot do that in order to choose security." So I think that resonates with what you've said, Carl and Christo. I don't know if you know Bonhoeffer. Does that resonate for you, ring true? Anybody?
Well, I mean, it definitely resonates true with me. It is very difficult to compare individual persons, but I think what you can do, and Judd, you pointed this out, is the comparison of motivations. And I think when Olivia was mentioning in the beginning that she said that the programs are about moral courage, resistance, and hope, then this is really what the value system that is the driving factor for certain persons are. It was definitely the case for Bonhoeffer, and it's definitely also the case for Navalny. So we feel this very strongly there.
Yeah. I think for Christo, why was Navalny allowed to openly continue political activity and protests in Russia for so many years? I mean, he was able to run for mayor in Moscow, in 2013, and he continued acting openly, although not with total security, right up to his poisoning. So the question is, why was he allowed? And then I have another question. So maybe Christo?
First of all, in 2013, when he ran for mayor, you could argue that that was a phenomenon that was convenient to the ruling elite, because he was able to splinter electorate away from somebody that the Kremlin did not want to win. So he was a third candidate. And at that time in 2013, you could argue that the Kremlin did not mind that there's this anti-corruption activist who has shown up and is appearing on the political horizon. What you also have to understand is that the Kremlin assumes that people know the rules of the game, and they assume that they will follow the rules of the game until people turn out to have agency of their own plans and don't follow the rule of the game as that they planned it for them. And I think this is an important factor to understand. When in 2014 and 15, Navalny continued with more and more aggressive criticism of the corruption of the system, going higher and higher, not attacking just local oligarchs and local governors, but going to the federal level. He was seen almost as a traitor by the Kremlin because, oh, we thought we had this little deal with you. We never verbalized it. We never sat down at the table to agree, but we thought it was a wink-wink situation. And for him, it wasn't. And this is important to understand because the moment the Kremlin perceives somebody to be changing the rules or exceeding their mandate, then they become a traitor. And then they go into the naughty list for assassinations. A lot of people are asking, why was Navalny singled out for an assassination? And I think this has to do with it, that he outgrew the mandate that somehow in a crazy head of a political technologist, Putin was told, "Oh, he's fine." So this is about the period about 2016. But 2017, the moment he decided to run for president, which was a gauntlet thrown in the face of Putin, that was the day on which the kill team started following him, and they were just waiting for the instructions. In the meantime, other things happened to him. He was almost blinded by two events. One is the chemical that was thrown into his face outside of his headquarters, and another one was an almost blinding swelling of the eyes that happened in jail when he was detained. So it was not like he was living a very comfortable life, but things indeed changed radically when he decided to run for president in 2017.
Okay, that's good to know. It's one of our questions that's coming up in the chats, which I also had, is how does Navalny, now that he is imprisoned, continue to get statements out to the public? And another part of that is also, who are Navalny's lawyers? Has Putin allowed him to freely choose his own, or are they state appointed? And there's more to that, but so those are the two questions that we have here.
Yeah, these two questions are interrelated because the only reason why Navalny is able to communicate to the rest of the world is because of Putin's insatiable desire to add more and more decades to Navalny's sentence. And because of that desire, there are more and more court cases that are opened against Navalny. The latest one that he got indicted, or he got actually sentenced to 19 years, has the absurd accusation and charges that Navalny created an extremist organization while sitting in jail and ran this organization from jail. The 250-page indictment contains absurd and surreal charges, such as there's literally a photograph of a picket by snowmen in Russia, each snowman holding a placard saying, our king has gone crazy. So this is a picket of snowmen that happened in 2021. Obviously, young people from the Navalny organization set this show in front of in Moscow. But Navalny is accused of essentially orchestrating this from jail. Because of these continuing indictments, he has access to lawyers while the indictment hasn't gone to court and resulted in a verdict, in a final verdict. And this allows him to pass messages through his lawyers. The Kremlin has tried to diminish that capability. They've introduced something like a confession wall between a priest and a parishioner that is between him and the lawyers. But that was clearly, even for Russian standards, that was so anti-constitutional that it was removed. And Navalny continued to be able to pass messages on paper through the lawyers. The lawyers are lawyers that have traditionally been lawyers for the FBK, which is the Anti-Corruption Foundation. They're among the bravest people I've seen. They're lawyers who are very outspoken. Their faces are household names and faces. And Putin is not omnipresent. He doesn't have the capability to actually say, oh, I want these lawyers jailed, because that would cause all the other lawyers to freak out. And even the lawyers that are loyal to the system will say, well, maybe I will be in that position next. So there's a limit to Putin's power, repressive power.
Okay, thank you. That really clarifies things. Another question that's coming up, which I will combine with one of mine, is I think, Carl, you mentioned how the current situation in Russia, like the mutiny by Prigozhin, the failed mutiny, and his Wagner mercenaries, what effect has that had on Navalny's current new sentencing, and also is his message? Does it have an effect on Navalny's message to Russians and his fate? Is there any hope? Will the regime really fall? Can it fall?
I honestly do believe there is no alternative to the regime falling. We just don't know when it is falling. I mean, this was already before. I don't know right now who said that, but there was this sentence that said you can do everything with a bayonet except sitting on it. And that's exactly what is currently happening in Russia. I mean, the Russian leaders are basically trying to sit and spend their time sitting on bayonets. That does not work necessarily on the long term. I mean, yes, of course, Putin still has impressive numbers of support when you look at the different opinion polls, whether they are true or not true. That is, of course, something which is debatable, but he definitely has still a very substantial support in Russia for his war in Ukraine. So, but I think also the Prigozhin expedition in direction Moscow has shown that there are certain limits to the abilities of being omnipotent. I mean, probably Prigozhin was expecting some more support from either the military or the political side, or most likely from both sides, which then didn't happen. So he was turning around, and Putin was one more time in the position to turn these things around. But this is not going to work on the long run. And I think if we think long term, and that's what we should be doing, this is where somebody like Navalny has to be factored in as somebody who has been standing up for principles and values that we in the West are also holding really up, and that can help. He can help with his organization, and he could be one of the persons that can help also implementing these values, which became a principle of Europe after the Second World War, but which were never implemented in the Soviet Union and let alone in Russia later. So it helped also for these principles to get a foothold in Russia on the long term.
I see. I have another question. Some people are asking about Navalny's family, where they are they, in what ways are they involved in his organization, in supporting him and getting messages out, etc.? Anybody?
I can address that. His family, his immediate nuclear family is outside of Russia. His brother also left Russia after serving out his term. He's not going to step on that twice, but his wife took a long time to make a decision to leave, and she did it only because her children or their children needed her support, and both of their children study abroad. I will not specify where, but she's with them. She's with the son, and her daughter is studying in the United States, actually. They're in Europe. I think it's important to also mention that outside of the nuclear family, there's also of people who have been working with and for the Navalny Foundation for years. And unfortunately, they had to leave the country as well, because they were all charged with extremism and terrorism, and they were equated to ISIS in Russian law. So all of these people are now living in Europe. The headquarters for the organization is in Lithuania, which gave them refuge status and facilities to work from. So this has become a large family of Navalny in a way, that together are working, and they're helping each other. They're helping people who protest the war by paying their fines in Russia. It's almost like an invitation to protest the war, which is not a mass thing that we see, unfortunately, but the symbol is there. The offer to go out in the street and we'll cover your legal bills is there, and it's coming from the Navalny large family.
Okay, one of the questions in the audience, which relates to what was discussed before, is how effective Navalny is. And the question is, what effect did his film on Putin's palace have in Russia? How widely was it seen, and did it have an effect? Anyone? And anybody can jump in who knows most about it. Christo?
I can very quickly answer. The Putin Palace film was something I did not believe in. They were filming that while we were doing the film that you have seen now. They were secretly preparing this documentary about Putin's palace, and I thought, but the Russians already know that their Tsar is corrupt, so how can you surprise them more? And the Navalny team told me, just wait. When you show it to them, when you show the crazy opulence that their leader is living in, with total disregard for the economic situation in the country, people will be shocked. I didn't believe that. People were shocked. This film was seen by every single Russian. It was seen by a total of 220 million people, which means that there were more than people in Russia who saw it, because there's not enough people in Russia. There were people that came into the streets right after the film premiered, and they were carrying golden brushes and golden toilet plungers, which were things that they had seen in the film as a symbol of how much they hate this degree of corruption. So I would say that this film played a crucial role in forever changing the perception of the thinking part of Russia about their dictator. It's not that they lost fear because the repressive machine is there, but they no longer believe that Putin is just as good or as bad as Western leaders.
Okay, thank you. I have a question that is a little perplexing to me too from the audience. They're asking if, and I have trouble pronouncing the name, if Kudryavtsev, as I recall, he is the man that was the last person that that Navalny confronted in the film. Am I right? Is he the man Correct. That was fooled, basically deceived, and gave all the information? That was an amazing stroke of luck as well as genius. And I have a question about that in a minute. But the question is perplexing. Someone wants to know, was he ever found in Russia, and was he able to be helped? Did this have consequences for him, I guess is the question.
Yeah, Carl will confirm that we tried to reach out to him the day after this interview was recorded and to help him. His phone was disconnected. Just a week later, his wife divorced him after this premiered, which was at least some justice. I feel good saying that he's alive. I mean, I know he's a wannabe killer and a wannabe poisoner, or actually a successful poisoner and a wannabe assassin, but I would have felt terrible if he was killed by his own. We found evidence that a year after the filming of that scene, he submitted himself to a COVID test and he was negative. So we know that he's alive and healthy. But he's without a wife. He was banished apparently outside of Moscow and given a desk job somewhere in the middle of Siberia. So at least that level of tiny justice has been delivered.
Well, that's interesting. He's obviously is so checkered in his reputation and actions, but one doesn't want to get someone into deep trouble anyway, I guess. I have a question for Carl. Carl, you operate a radio station in Ukraine, and I would like you please to tell us a little more about it. In making a connection to Germany for the moment, again, Nazi Germany. In Nazi Germany, the Nazis, it was forbidden to listen to foreign news broadcasts, in particular the BBC. And so the Nazis created a radio called the Volksempfänger, which could only be tuned to German stations. But of course, people listened to the BBC secretly, like the White Rose Student Resistance. So my question is, what are the motivations for you in creating your Ukraine radio station? What's its purpose? Is it like a radio for Russia and Ukraine? Does it reach Russians?
Well, I mean, the project goes much further back than the war, actually. We started, and of course, Christo was also involved in that. We have both our interests in radio, and Christo introduced me to that. We started in 2007 with our first radio station in the Ukraine, but it was a purely commercial radio station at the time. And then, of course, the political situation changed in the Ukraine several times, as we know. I mean, first it was rather pro-European, and then it suddenly changed, and we had the revolution, and we had the different presidents that were coming in. And so also, of course, we had to rebrand the radio station several times. So for some time, we were asked to make a particular European program, which we happily did, introducing European countries and their specialties, from culinary to music to everything else in it. But then, of course, with the war, we were also asked to kind of adapt the radio station to the situation of the war. I mean, we were an independent radio station operated by foreign operators, but of course, the producers themselves are Ukrainian. We were kind of asked to kind of give it, of course, for a country that is at war, give it a patriotic touch, bring Ukrainian music into it, and make a program that will be heard there, but that is also, of course, talking about the war, giving a correct situation about the war. In the beginning, in February, 24th of February last year, we were not able to broadcast anymore from Kiev. In the beginning, we had to get out. We had to broadcast from small little makeshift studios that we did in some sheds. Basically, wherever we had internet access, we were able to broadcast from there. It was quite an interesting time until we were able to go back to Kiev and do this there. But then, of course, we had also developed a relationship with the government and with the military, and we were quite often asked to do specific programs that were in the interest of what the war was. And I just give you just one example here, which I thought was very moving at the time, was the fact that somebody came up to us who was a musician, an opera singer, who said that children are particularly affected through the war when they have to sit for weeks on end in a bunker. And so he was asking us to introduce in our normal music radio program, which of course had a lot of news on the side, also a special program for children where we were reading fairy tales. And so we had, in the evenings, we had a special fairy tale program. And we were told later that lots of families were gathering in the bunkers around the radio for these 15 minutes of fairy tales, which was basically taking their mind off of the daily bombardments and bring them to something else. And I think it was more these type of actions that we were doing and that we were able to do with the radio station and still are able to do it today, to bring on one side some realism in a extremely complicated situation, but also we decided to we have to keep on, I don't want to use the word entertaining, but it is at the end, it's entertaining, take the mind off sometimes from what is actually happening there, but mixing it in the right mix with the real situation, with the real information that is coming through. Just one little last word to that, and that is of course, at the time when this happened, we were looking very much, and I say this because you mentioned this in the beginning, in different radio stations that were developed during the Second World War, but not only in Europe, but also in Japan. And it was an extremely interesting study that we did at the time in the different radio stations. We found particularly one radio program that was an American radio program done for Japan at the time, which was an incredibly good radio program that we were kind of learning a lot from the study of these different examples.
So I think we're reaching the end of the hour, and I'd like to give our panel an opportunity to make any closing remarks they would like to make. So Christo, let's start with you.
I think it's important to keep in mind that the 19 years jail sentence, additional jail sentence that was given to Navalny just now is nothing but a symbol of the crumbling regime. It's not a show of force, it's quite the opposite. And I want to take the chance to connect this to actually the question about Prigozhin's failed coup. The failed coup achieved a major outcome, which was it showed how fragile Putin is. It showed that it was a 50-50 chance that Prigozhin might have reached Moscow with only 8,000 people and might have taken out Putin. And it might have been much worse for Russia for a while, at least, if he had done that, or much better for Russia if that was a short-lived new dictatorship. But it showed that Putin is not in control. And lashing out at Navalny with 19 years for a crime that is clearly impossible to be perpetrated from jail is not a sign of force. It's not a show of force. It's an attempt to show force, but it's quite the opposite. And I think this is something we should keep in mind to understand Carl's prognosis that this regime will crumble quite soon.
Now, there is somebody in our audience who is asking you to repeat the name of Navalny's organization so that those who are interested might be able to donate.
Absolutely. It is called the Anti-Corruption Fund, Anti-Corruption Foundation. In Russian, it is spelled FBK, or just look out for Anti-Corruption Foundation Russia, and you will find many ways that you can sponsor and donate to this wonderful organization, which is the only thing close to an opposition political party in Russia, because, as Carl said, they have a presence in more than 200 places in Russia.
Now, Mr. Carl von Habsburg, we are connected because we have the same hero. So tell me what you would like to say to our audience in closing today.
Well, since we were talking about Navalny today, I think one thing which is incredibly important is that he can only survive if we don't forget him. And what you have been doing with Sousa Mendes was bringing him out of an area where nobody was remembering Sousa Mendes, and you put him into the public light. And we all helped together to kind of do that by giving him the public exposure that he needed, that his deeds, whatever he did for all the people that he helped, was something that is getting recognized today. And in the same way, it is incredibly important that we don't allow Navalny to kind of slip into kind of a dark area where he's not, where his offerings are not, and his abilities are not recognized anymore. So we are all asked basically to try and keep Navalny in the public eye and talk about him and see that he basically stays in focus, because it should be also our interest that we're convinced that he's somebody who can do something good for Russia in the future.
Yes, that's a great lesson for us all. Judd, my dear friend, Dr. Newborn, the last word goes to you.
Well, I agree with I'm very interested and agree with the final thoughts of our guests. And, you know, there's a phrase that was obscure at one point, which is called speaking truth to power. It's become more and more used, especially since Donald Trump came to power and with Fox News and so forth. So I'm very grateful to people who, like Navalny, and all of us who speak truth to power and decide to be activists in the fight against authoritarianism and for human rights, democracy. And this has to be our fight too, at home and abroad. And that's my final thought.
Well, it's been an utter privilege to be able to present this film to you, our beloved audience. And wow, to have Carl von Habsburg and Christo Grozev on our panel. This is my dream come true. So thank you to our fantastic panel. Thank you to our audience. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. See you next time. Be well. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.